General Maurice Gamelin was having breakfast when the telephone rang at 5:30 a.m. on May 10, 1940. The French commander-in-chief answered with the casual confidence of a man who believed he commanded the world's most powerful army. "The Germans are crossing the Belgian border," his aide reported. Gamelin actually smiled. This was exactly what he had been waiting for. After 21 years of preparation since the Great War, the Germans were finally making their move, and they were doing exactly what French military planners had predicted they would do. What Gamelin didn't know was that at that exact moment, German tank commanders were laughing as they read intercepted French radio messages. The French were celebrating because they thought the real German attack was coming through Belgium. But the biggest armored force in military history was already deep in the Ardennes forest, moving through terrain that every French expert had declared impossible for tanks. In just 36 hours, these German panzers would emerge from the forest and begin the most devastating military advance in modern warfare. The French had spent 3 billion francs building the Maginot Line, the most advanced fortress system ever constructed. They had 3.3 million men under arms, more tanks than Germany, and the backing of the British Empire. French generals had studied every German move in World War I and had built their entire strategy around preventing another long, bloody stalemate. They were so confident that some French newspapers were already calling it the phony war because nothing exciting had happened for months. But within 6 weeks, these same French generals would be signing surrender documents in the exact same railway car where Germany had been humiliated in 1918. The speed of their defeat would be so shocking that even German commanders couldn't believe what they had accomplished. How did the most powerful military in Europe collapse so completely that its generals couldn't even comprehend what had happened to them? The morning of May 10 started like any other for General Gamelin. He had planned for this moment for years. His strategy was simple and, he believed, foolproof. The Germans would attack through Belgium, just like they had in 1914. The French army would advance into Belgium, meet the Germans head-on, and fight them to a standstill, just like the previous war. It was called Plan D, and every French general believed it was brilliant. But what the French didn't know was that this entire Belgian offensive was a massive deception. While Army Group B attacked through Belgium and Holland, drawing French and British forces northward like a magnet, the real German strike force Army Group A was quietly moving through the Ardennes forest. The French had dismissed this route as impossible. Their own intelligence reports stated that the Ardennes was impenetrable for large armored formations. General Charles Hunsiger, commanding the Second Army facing the Ardennes, had so little concern about this sector that he'd nicknamed it the Quiet Front. The French military doctrine was still rooted in World War I thinking. They believed that tanks were mobile pillboxes, meant to support infantry attacks. Their tanks were actually superior to German tanks in many ways: thicker armor, bigger guns, but they were scattered across the front in small groups. The French Char B-1 tank could destroy any German tank it encountered, but French commanders used them like slow-moving fortresses rather than concentrated spearheads. Meanwhile, the Germans had developed something revolutionary: Blitzkrieg. This wasn't just about fast tanks, it was about coordination. German panzers moved in concentrated masses, supported by dive-bombing Stukas that acted like flying artillery. Radio communication allowed instant coordination between tanks, aircraft, and infantry. While French generals were still relying on telephone lines and motorcycle messengers, German commanders were directing battles in real time from the front lines. On May 12, 2 days into the invasion, German tanks began emerging from the Ardennes like a steel avalanche. General Heinz Guderian's had achieved what the French considered impossible: they had moved an entire armored army through terrain that French experts had declared impassable for tanks. As German panzers reached the Meuse River at Sedan, French generals finally began to understand that something was terribly wrong. The crossing at Sedan became the moment that changed everything. French defenders at the Meuse were confident they could hold. Rivers were natural defensive barriers, and crossing under fire was supposed to be nearly impossible. But the Germans didn't just send infantry across in boats. They coordinated the largest air attack in military history up to that point.
Wave after wave of Stuka dive bombers screamed down on French positions, their sirens howling like banshees.
The psychological effect was devastating. French soldiers had never experienced anything like it. One survivor described it as like being inside a thunderstorm made of explosions. The German air attack wasn't random bombing, it was surgically precise. They targeted French artillery positions, command posts, and communication lines. Within hours, French commanders lost contact with their forward units. General Hunziker's headquarters couldn't even communicate with divisions that were less than 10 miles away. But the real breakthrough came when German engineers began building pontoon bridges across the Meuse under cover of the air attacks. French artillery tried to destroy these bridges, but German fighters and dive bombers protected them like aerial umbrellas. By the evening of May 13, German tanks were pouring across the river in numbers that shocked French observers. One French colonel reported seeing an endless stream of panzers, more tanks than we believed the Germans possessed in their entire army. What the French didn't realize was that the Germans had concentrated almost their entire armored strength at this single point. While French tanks were spread across hundreds of miles of front, the Germans had massed over 1,500 tanks in a corridor just 15 miles wide. It was like focusing sunlight through a magnifying glass, the concentrated power was irresistible. General Gamelin received the first reports of the breakthrough on the morning of May 14. His initial reaction was disbelief. Impossible, he told his staff. Our intelligence indicates that the Germans have no more than 2 or 3 divisions in the Ardennes. But as more reports flooded in, each more alarming than the last, the French commander began to realize that everything he thought he knew about German capabilities was wrong. The speed of the German advance was beyond anything seen in military history. By May 15, just 5 days after the invasion began, German spearheads had advanced over 60 miles into France. They weren't just breaking through, they were creating a gap in French lines that was growing wider every hour. French reserve divisions rushed toward the breakthrough, but they were moving by train and truck while German panzers advanced cross-country at maximum speed. The psychological impact on French command was catastrophic. These generals had spent 2 decades preparing to fight the last war. They had built their entire military philosophy around static defense and methodical attacks. Suddenly, they were facing an enemy that moved faster than their ability to react. Orders issued by French headquarters were obsolete before they reached the front lines. Winston Churchill, who had just become British Prime Minister, flew to Paris on May 16 for an emergency meeting with French leaders. What he found shocked him. The French government was already burning official papers in the courtyard of the Quai d'Orsay. When Churchill asked where the strategic reserve was, General Gamelin gave him an answer that would echo through history: there is no reserve. The French had committed everything to their initial deployment. They had no mobile force capable of stopping the German breakthrough. The German advance now began to accelerate at a pace that seemed impossible. Guderian's panzers weren't just advancing, they were racing toward the English Channel. French generals watched in horror as German tanks appeared in places they weren't supposed to reach for weeks. The city of Amiens fell on May 20, just 10 days after the invasion began. German tanks had advanced 200 miles in 10 days, cutting through France like a knife through butter. But the most shocking moment came when German spearheads reached the Channel coast at Abbeville on May 20. In just 10 days, the Germans had cut France in half. The entire British expeditionary force and France's best armies were now trapped in a pocket around Dunkirk. General Gamelin stared at the map in his headquarters and for the first time began to contemplate the unthinkable, that France might actually lose this war. The French attempted several counterattacks, but they were like trying to stop a flood with sandbags. At the Battle of Arras on May 21, British and French tanks actually succeeded in surprising German forces and caused panic in some German units. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Allied counterattack might succeed. But the effort was too little, too late. German reserves quickly contained the breakthrough, and within 48 hours, the Allied attack had collapsed. What made the German success even more shocking was how few casualties they had suffered. The Wehrmacht was advancing at incredible speed while losing relatively few men and machines. Traditional military wisdom held that attackers should outnumber defenders by at least 3 to 1 to succeed. But the Germans were winning while being outnumbered overall because they achieved local superiority at the point of attack through superior coordination and speed. The evacuation at Dunkirk became both a miracle and a symbol of French collapse. While the British managed to evacuate over 300,000 troops, they had to abandon virtually all their heavy equipment. Thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and trucks were left on the beaches. But more importantly for France, some of their best-trained divisions were trapped in the Dunkirk pocket. These were precisely the mobile, experienced units that France needed to continue the fight. By early June, German forces were advancing on Paris itself. The city that had withstood a 4-year siege in World War I was now threatened after less than a month of fighting. French generals who had spent their entire careers preparing for a long, grinding war of attrition suddenly found themselves in a battle of mobility and speed that they couldn't understand, let alone win. The French government fled Paris on June 10. The sight of official cars streaming out of the capital while German tanks approached from the north created scenes of panic throughout France. Millions of French civilians joined the exodus, creating massive refugee columns that clogged the roads and made military movement almost impossible. The German Air Force targeted these refugee columns, not out of cruelty, but because French military units were mixed in with the civilians. General Maxime Weygand, who had replaced Gamelin as French commander, attempted to organize a final defensive line along the Somme and Aisne rivers. This was France's last hope, to create a new front line and stabilize the situation. But the German advance had been so rapid that French forces barely had time to dig in before German attacks resumed. The Wehrmacht had maintained its momentum while French forces were demoralized and disorganized. The final German offensive, Operation Red, began on June 5. This time, the Germans didn't need to achieve surprise or break through fortified lines. French resistance was crumbling everywhere. German tanks advanced through open countryside, encountering scattered resistance that was quickly overwhelmed. The speed of advance actually accelerated, some German units were moving over 40 miles per day. Paris fell on June 14 without a fight. The French government had declared it an open city to avoid destruction. German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées while French generals watched from hiding or exile. The sight of German soldiers goose-stepping past the Arc de Triomphe was broadcast around the world, a symbol of the most rapid military collapse in modern history. But even as Paris fell, many French generals still believed they could continue fighting from other parts of France or from the French Empire in North Africa. The idea of complete surrender seemed impossible. France had never surrendered in its entire history as a unified nation. Even in 1870, when the Germans had captured Napoleon III, the French had continued fighting. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun in World War I, was called upon to form a new government. On June 17, just 38 days after the German invasion began, Pétain announced that France was seeking an armistice with Germany. For French generals who had spent their careers believing in French military superiority, this announcement was like a physical blow. The armistice was signed on June 22 in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler had insisted on this location as a deliberate humiliation. The ceremony was carefully choreographed by the Germans to emphasize the reversal of fortunes. Adolf Hitler personally attended the ceremony, and witnesses described his expression as one of satisfied revenge. The final statistics were almost impossible to believe. In just 46 days, Germany had conquered France, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, and Norway. The French army, which had been considered the strongest in the world, had lost 360,000 casualties and seen 1.9 million soldiers taken prisoner. German casualties were approximately 150,000 total. The speed and completeness of the victory shocked even German commanders. General Guderian later wrote in his memoirs that even he had not expected such rapid success. The German plan had called for a campaign lasting several months, similar to World War I. Instead, they had achieved in 6 weeks what the Kaiser's armies had failed to accomplish in 4 years. The psychological impact on French military leadership was devastating and long-lasting. For the French generals who survived the campaign, the defeat was more than a military disaster, it was a complete invalidation of everything they had believed about warfare. These men had studied at France's elite military academies, had served in World War I, and had spent 2 decades preparing for the next German attack. Yet when that attack came, they had been as helpless as children.
The speed of the German victory had implications far beyond France.
It convinced Hitler that the German military was invincible, leading to the disastrous decision to invade the Soviet Union. It brought the United States closer to entering the war, as Americans realized that the Atlantic Ocean might not protect them if Britain fell. And it demonstrated to military leaders worldwide that the nature of warfare had fundamentally changed. The fall of France in 46 days remains one of the most shocking military events in history. It proved that technological and tactical innovation could overcome numerical superiority, that speed and coordination could defeat static defense, and that even the strongest military traditions could become obsolete overnight. For the French generals who lived through it, the experience was so traumatic that many never fully recovered their confidence in French military capabilities. The defeat also created myths that persisted for decades. Many people assumed that French soldiers had simply refused to fight, or that French equipment was inferior to German weapons. In reality, French soldiers often fought bravely when properly led, and French tanks and artillery were generally superior to German equivalents. The decisive factors were German tactical innovation, superior coordination, and the psychological shock of encountering a completely new form of warfare. Today, military historians still study the fall of France as a case study in how rapidly military situations can change. The campaign demonstrated that in modern warfare, the side that can adapt fastest to new conditions has an enormous advantage. The French generals who couldn't believe they had been forced to surrender in just 46 days had learned this lesson too late to save their country, but their experience became a warning for military leaders around the world about the dangers of fighting the last war instead of the current one.